Margaret Wilkins walked through Sycamore Estates with her clipboard, checking for any violations of the HOA rules. At 58, she had been the president of the Homeowners Association for 15 years, and she took great pride in keeping the neighborhood looking perfect. Her gray hair was always neatly styled, and she wore pressed khaki pants with polo shirts that had the HOA logo on them. The neighbors called her Karen behind her back, but most were too afraid to challenge her to her face. It was a warm April morning when Margaret first spotted the blue oval shape in Jason Chen's backyard. She stopped in her tracks and narrowed her eyes. An above-ground pool was being installed, and she had no memory of approving such a structure. Her face turned red as she marched across the street toward Jason's house. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Margaret called out, waving her clipboard in the air. Jason Chen, a 35-year-old civil engineer who had moved to Sycamore Estates just 3 months ago, looked up from where he was connecting a filter to his new pool. His 2 children, ages 6 and 8, were excitedly helping by handing him tools. "Hi, Mrs. Wilkins. We're setting up our summer pool," Jason said with a smile. "The kids can't wait to start swimming." Margaret's lips formed a tight line. "I don't recall approving this structure. All exterior modifications need HOA approval, as clearly stated in Section 7 of our community guidelines." Jason wiped his hands on a towel and walked to meet Margaret at the edge of his property. "I submitted the paperwork last month," he explained calmly. "I have the receipt from when I handed it to the secretary. She said everything looked good." "Well, I never signed off on it," Margaret insisted, making notes on her clipboard. "This pool will have to come down until proper approval is granted." Jason's smile faded. "Mrs. Wilkins, I followed all the rules. I paid the review fee, waited the required time, and when I heard nothing back, the guidelines state that means implicit approval after 30 days. Several neighbors had come outside to watch the confrontation. Tom Johnson, who lived next door to Jason, nodded in agreement. Tom had had his own battles with Margaret over the years. "The pool meets all the setback requirements," Jason continued. "It's the right distance from the property line, and I've added the safety fence as required by county code. There's no reason for disapproval." Margaret's face grew redder. "That's not for you to decide. I am the HOA president, and I say this was not approved." Jason stood his ground. "I have a copy of everything inside. Would you like to see it?" "That won't be necessary," Margaret snapped. "You'll receive a formal violation notice tomorrow. This pool needs to be removed within 7 days." As she turned to leave, Jason called after her, "Mrs. Wilkins, my family saved for this pool all year. My paperwork is in order. If there was an administrative error, that's not my fault." Margaret turned back, her eyes cold. "Rules are rules, Mr. Chen. No exceptions." That evening, Margaret called an emergency meeting with 3 board members who always voted her way. They sat in her living room drinking tea as she explained the eyesore in the Chen backyard. "We need to send a message," Margaret said firmly. "If we let this stand, everyone will start putting up pools and trampolines and who knows what else. Our property values will plummet." The board members nodded in agreement, not wanting to cross Margaret. None of them asked to see Jason's paperwork or the receipt he claimed to have. 2 days later, Jason found a formal violation notice taped to his front door. The battle had officially begun, and neither side was willing to back down. Over the next 2 months, the tension between Margaret Wilkins and Jason Chen grew worse with each passing day. After the first violation notice, Jason sent a formal letter to the HOA board with copies of all his paperwork, including the date-stamped receipt from the HOA secretary and a copy of the guidelines showing the 30-day automatic approval rule. Margaret's response came 3 days later, a second violation notice with an added $50 daily fine until the pool was removed. "This is ridiculous," Jason told his wife Mai as they sat at their kitchen table looking at the new notice. "We did everything by the book." Mai sighed as she watched their children splash happily in the pool through the window. "Maybe we should talk to a lawyer, Jason. The kids love the pool, and we spent almost $8,000 on it." The next day, Jason called David Garcia, a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. After reviewing all the documents, David was confident. "You're in the right here, Jason," he said. "That HOA has to follow its own rules. I'll send them a letter explaining that their actions violate state law regarding HOA procedures." The lawyer's letter only seemed to make Margaret more determined. She began driving by Jason's house 3 times a day, taking photos with her phone and writing in her clipboard. She also started approaching Jason's neighbors. "Aren't you concerned about your property values?" she asked Tom Johnson one afternoon. "That pool is an eyesore and a safety hazard. What if some neighborhood child falls in and drowns? We could all be liable." Tom just shook his head. "Margaret, the man has a safety fence and a locked gate. My kids are friends with his kids. It's just a normal family pool." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I see whose side you're on, then." By June, Margaret had increased the daily fines to $100 and sent warning letters to any neighbors who publicly supported Jason. She called another emergency board meeting, but this time, 2 board members expressed concerns. "Margaret, I reviewed his paperwork," said Barb Williams, the board treasurer. "You really did submit everything correctly. The secretary even admits she received it." "That's not the point," Margaret snapped. "The point is that pools like this lower the tone of our community. We're not some trailer park." After the meeting, Margaret went home and created a special Chen violation folder on her computer. She filled it with daily photos of the pool, copies of the violation notices, and a spreadsheet tracking the growing fines, which now totaled over $4,000. Meanwhile, Jason continued fighting back. He posted his situation on a neighborhood social media group, drawing support from residents throughout Sycamore Estates. He installed security cameras around his property after noticing Margaret walking along the edge of his yard taking measurements. The attorney sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding that all fines be cancelled and that Margaret stop her harassment. One hot afternoon in late June, Margaret confronted Jason as he was coming home from work. "The fines will keep adding up until you remove that monstrosity," she said, blocking his driveway with her body. "You think you're so clever with your lawyer and your paperwork, but I've been running this HOA for 15 years. Nobody wins against me." Jason calmly took out his phone and began recording. "Mrs. Wilkins, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop blocking my driveway and stop harassing my family. All of this is documented, and my attorney advises that your actions may constitute personal harassment beyond HOA business." Margaret's face turned a deep shade of red. "Are you threatening me?" "No, just stating facts. Now please, move away from my car." As Margaret finally stepped aside, she hissed, "This isn't over, Mr. Chen. Not by a long shot." That evening, as Jason and Mai watched their children play in the pool, Mai expressed concern. "She seems obsessed, Jason. It's getting scary." Jason nodded grimly. "Don't worry. The security cameras are working, and David says we have a solid case if we need to take legal action." Neither of them realized just how far Margaret was willing to go to win this battle. The 4th of July weekend arrived with perfect swimming weather. All around Sycamore Estates, families prepared for barbecues and celebrations. Jason and Mei Chen were packing their minivan for a 3-day trip to visit Mei's parents in the next state over. "Did you remember to set the security system?" Mei asked as she helped their daughter Emma load her backpack into the car. "All done," Jason replied, checking his phone to make sure the camera app was working. "And Tom next door promised to keep an eye on the house while we're gone." What the Chen family didn't know was that Margaret Wilkins had been watching their house all morning from her living room window. She had seen them loading suitcases and had overheard Jason telling another neighbor they would be back on Monday. A plan that had been forming in her mind for weeks was now ready to be put into action. At 7:30 a.m. on Saturday, just hours after the Chens had left, Margaret made a phone call. "Bensonville Concrete?" "Yes, this is Margaret Wilkins, president of the Sycamore Estates Homeowners Association. I need an emergency fill job today. How soon can you get a crew here?" By 9:00 a.m., a concrete truck and 3 workers arrived at the community entrance where Margaret waited with her clipboard and a folder of official-looking papers. "Follow me," she directed, leading them to Jason's house. From her purse, she produced a set of keys. "These are the emergency access keys. As HOA president, I have authority to enter properties for emergency remediation." The lead worker, Mike, looked uncertain. "Ma'am, we usually need the homeowner present for a job like this." Margaret handed him a document with the HOA letterhead. "This is the board authorization for emergency action. The homeowner was given multiple notices, but failed to comply with safety regulations. This pool is in violation of community guidelines and local ordinances. Mike scanned the paper, which looked official enough with its stamps and signatures. And you're sure the homeowner knows about this? Multiple written notices, Margaret stated firmly. All documented. Now, we need to drain that pool completely before filling it. Can your team handle that? For the next hour, the workers pumped water from Jason's pool, draining it into the storm drains at the street corner. Neighbors began to notice the activity. Tom Johnson, who had promised to watch the Chen's house, rushed over from his yard. Margaret, what the hell are you doing? He demanded. Margaret stood tall, clipboard clasped to her chest. Official HOA business, Tom. The Chen pool was never approved and poses a safety hazard. The board voted for emergency removal. That's bull, Tom argued. I'm on the board, and we never voted on this. It was an emergency session last night. Perhaps you should check your email more regularly, Margaret replied coldly. Now please step back from the work area. Tom pulled out his phone. I'm calling Jason right now. Go ahead, Margaret said with a smirk. But it won't change anything. This is completely legal. As Tom walked away to make the call, another neighbor began recording the scene on her phone. Margaret noticed but didn't stop her. In her mind, she was simply enforcing the rules that everyone had agreed to when they moved into Sycamore Estates. By early afternoon, the pool was drained. The concrete truck backed up to Jason's yard, and the workers began pouring gray cement into the empty pool shell. Margaret watched with satisfaction as the mixture filled every corner, permanently destroying the structure. Make sure it's level, she instructed the workers. We don't want any pooling when it rains. Tom returned, his face red with anger. Jason's been trying to call you. He says this is illegal, and he's calling the police. Margaret rolled her eyes. The police won't get involved in a civil HOA matter. You should have thought about consequences before breaking the rules. As the concrete set in the summer heat, Margaret took photos with her phone, already planning how she would present this victory at the next HOA meeting. In her mind, she had won. The ICER was gone, and she had sent a powerful message to anyone else who might think about challenging her authority. What Margaret didn't understand was that she had just crossed the line from civil dispute into criminal territory, a distinction that would soon become painfully clear to her. Jason Chen had 23 missed calls on his phone when he finally checked it Sunday evening at his in-laws' house. Most were from Tom Johnson, but there were also calls from other neighbors and one from a number he didn't recognize. Something's wrong, he told Mai as he listened to the first voicemail from Tom. Jason, you need to call me back right away. Margaret Wilkins brought a concrete truck to your house. She's filling in your pool. I tried to stop her, but she claims she has HOA approval. Call me back. Jason's hands began to shake as he played the next message, and the next. Each one confirmed the unbelievable news. By the time he reached the last voicemail, which was from Officer Rivera of the Bensonville Police Department, Jason was already grabbing his car keys. We need to go home. Now, he told Mai, his voice tight with controlled anger. They packed up the car in record time, explained the emergency to Mai's confused parents, and began the 3-hour drive home in the dark. The children fell asleep in the back seat while Jason and Mai tried to make sense of what had happened. She can't just destroy our property, Mai said for the 10th time. That's not how HOAs work, even with violations. No, it's not, Jason agreed grimly. What she did is criminal. Pure and simple. They pulled into their driveway just before midnight. Jason turned on his phone's flashlight and walked straight to the backyard, with Mai close behind. What they saw left them speechless. Where their blue pool had stood was now a gray concrete slab, slightly higher than the surrounding grass. The safety fence was gone. The filter equipment lay in a damaged heap beside the shed. Oh my God, Mai whispered, her hand covering her mouth. She really did it. Jason stood still, shining his light over the destruction. $8,000 and countless hours of work, destroyed in a single day. He took several deep breaths, then pulled out his phone and opened his security camera app. Let's see exactly what happened, he said. The backyard camera had captured everything. Margaret arriving with the concrete crew, using a key to enter their backyard gate, directing the workers as they drained the pool, and then the hours-long process of filling it with cement. The camera even recorded her taking triumphant photos when the job was done. She used a key, Mai noted, her voice rising in disbelief. How does she have a key to our gate? Emergency access keys, Jason realized. That HOA has them for emergencies like gas leaks or fires. She abused her position to get access. At 7:00 a.m. the next morning, Jason called the number Officer Rivera had left in his voicemail. Within 30 minutes, a police car pulled up in front of their house. Officer Rivera, a serious-looking woman in her 40s, introduced herself and her partner, Officer Tran. We received several calls from concerned neighbors on Saturday, Officer Rivera explained as they walked to the backyard. By the time we arrived to check, the concrete company had already left, and Ms. Wilkins refused to answer her door. Jason showed them the concrete slab, then played the security footage on his tablet. The officers watched carefully, taking notes. This is clearly criminal damage to property, Officer Tran said. The value exceeds $5,000, which makes it a felony in this state. There's also breaking and entering, since she used that key without authorization for a non-emergency. And we have documentation showing the pool was submitted for approval correctly, Jason added, showing them the folder of paperwork he had prepared for his attorney. Officer Rivera nodded. We'll need copies of all of this, the video footage, your receipts for the pool, and any communications with Ms. Wilkins or the HOA. As they talked, a small crowd of neighbors gathered in front of the house. Tom Johnson came over, still in his bathrobe. I tried to stop her, Jason, he said apologetically. She claimed there was an emergency board meeting that approved this. There was no meeting. Officer Rivera made another note. That's false representation, another potential charge. Jason looked at the concrete slab once more, then back at the officers. I want to press charges, he said firmly. All of them. Officer Rivera nodded. Based on what we've seen, Miss Wilkins will have a lot to answer for. Margaret Wilkins was enjoying her morning coffee and feeling quite satisfied with herself when the doorbell rang. It had been 2 days since she had solved the pool problem, and she was certain the other homeowners had gotten her message about following the rules. When she opened the door, she found Officers Rivera and Tran standing on her porch with serious expressions. Margaret Wilkins. Officer Rivera asked formally. Yes, that's me, Margaret replied, her smile fading. Is there a problem? Ms. Wilkins, we're here to place you under arrest for criminal damage to property, breaking and entering, fraudulent misrepresentation, and theft of services, Officer Rivera stated, reading from a small notepad. Margaret's coffee mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Arrest? That's absurd. I was performing my duties as HOA president. Ma'am, please turn around and place your hands behind your back, Officer Tran instructed firmly. This is outrageous. Margaret protested as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. I was enforcing our community guidelines. That pool was never approved. Officer Rivera recited the Miranda rights while neighbors peeked through windows and stepped onto porches to watch. Margaret's face burned with humiliation as she was escorted to the police car. At the police station, Margaret sat in an interview room for nearly 2 hours before a detective entered with a thick folder. Ms. Wilkins, I'm Detective Wilson, he said, sitting across from her. Do you understand the seriousness of the charges against you? This is all a misunderstanding, Margaret insisted. As HOA president, I have the authority to remedy violations. That pool was against our rules. Detective Wilson opened the folder and laid out several photos. We have video evidence of you using an emergency access key to enter the Chen property without permission, directing workers to destroy an $8,000 pool, and falsely claiming you had HOA board approval. I did have approval, Margaret said quickly. No, you didn't. We've spoken with all 5 board members. There was no emergency meeting, no vote, and no authorization. The detective pulled out a document. This paper you showed the concrete company, it's a forgery. Margaret's confident facade began to crack. I was just doing my job. Your job doesn't include destroying private property, the detective replied. The district attorney is reviewing the case, but I can tell you now, these are felony charges. Each one carries potential prison time. Margaret's attorney, Richard Hayes, arrived an hour later. After a private consultation, his face was grim. Margaret, this is extremely serious, he told her. The evidence against you is overwhelming. But it was just a pool violation, Margaret protested. Hayes shook his head. No, it was destruction of property valued at over $5,000, which makes it a Class 3 felony in this state. That alone carries up to 5 years in prison. Add the breaking and entering, fraud, and other charges. Margaret's face went pale. Prison? I can't go to prison. I was just enforcing the rules. HOA rules aren't laws, Margaret. HOAs can issue fines or pursue civil court actions. They can't destroy property. What you did was criminal. Later that afternoon, Margaret was formally charged and released on $25,000 bail. As she left the courthouse, she saw news vans parked outside. A reporter rushed toward her with a microphone. Ms. Wilkins, do you have any comment on the allegations that you illegally destroyed a family's swimming pool? Margaret hurried to her car with her head down as cameras flashed around her. Her phone had dozens of missed calls, most from angry neighbors and board members. When she got home, she found a notice taped to her door. The HOA board had called an emergency meeting, a real one this time, and had voted unanimously to remove her as president, effective immediately. Margaret sank into her living room chair, finally beginning to understand the severity of what she had done. This wasn't about pool violations anymore. It was about her freedom. And for the first time, she felt genuinely afraid. The emergency meeting of the Sycamore Estates Homeowners Association was the most crowded in the community's history. Nearly all 120 homeowners packed into the small community center, with people standing along the walls and spilling out the door. The 4 remaining board members sat at a table at the front, looking uncomfortable. Order, please, called Barbara Williams, who had stepped in as acting president after Margaret's removal. She banged a gavel several times until the room quieted. I know everyone is upset about recent events. We're here to address the situation and move forward. Move forward, shouted someone from the back. Margaret destroyed a family's pool and got the HOA sued. We're all going to be paying for her crazy power trip. The room erupted again. Jason Chen sat quietly in the third row, his attorney David Garcia beside him. He had filed a civil lawsuit against both Margaret and the HOA the previous day. Barbara banged the gavel again. Please, one at a time, we understand your concerns, and that's why we called this meeting. Tom Johnson stood up. I've lived here for 12 years, and I've watched Margaret bully people the entire time. This isn't her first abuse of power. It's just the worst one. How many of you have been harassed by her over trivial things? At least 30 hands went up around the room. An elderly woman named Rose Martinez slowly stood with the help of her cane. She fined me $200 last year because my roses were the wrong shade of red. She said they didn't match the approved color palette. They were my grandmother's heirloom roses. Others began sharing their stories. Fines for having basketball hoops, children's toys visible in yards, garbage cans left out an hour too long. Each story revealed a pattern of Margaret's controlling behavior that had gotten worse over the years. Why didn't anyone stop her sooner? Someone asked. Barbara looked down at her hands. We should have. The board should have reamed her in years ago, but she always knew the rules better than anyone else. She made it sound like she was protecting our property values. David Garcia, Jason's attorney, raised his hand and was recognized. As you all know, my client has filed the civil lawsuit for damages. However, I want to clarify something important. We are suing Margaret Wilkins personally for her actions and the HOA's insurance policy, not individual homeowners. A wave of relief passed through the room. That said, Garcia continued, this incident reveals serious problems with your HOA's governance structure. One person should never have had the power Margaret wielded. As part of any settlement, we'll be requesting significant changes to your bylaws. The meeting continued for 3 hours. By the end, the community had voted to 1. Completely remove Margaret from any HOA position for life. 2. Create a new oversight committee to review all violation notices. 3. Require at least 3 board members to approve any fines. 4. Change all emergency access keys and create strict rules for their use. 5. Hold new board elections within 30 days. As people filed out, many stopped to speak with Jason, offering support and apologies. We should have helped you stand up to her sooner, said Rose Martinez, patting his arm. Maybe this wouldn't have happened. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret sat alone in her house with the blinds drawn, Her phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters and angry neighbors. Her daughter in Arizona had begged her to come stay with her until things calmed down, but Margaret refused to leave. "They'll see I was right," she told her daughter over the phone. "The rules exist for a reason. That pool was never properly approved." "Mom, you destroyed someone's property," her daughter replied. "This isn't about pool rules anymore. You're facing felony charges. This could ruin your life." Margaret hung up the phone and looked at the framed certificate on her wall, recognizing her 15 years of service as HOA president. Next to it was the community's Best Maintained Property Award she had won 5 years in a row. For the first time, Margaret wondered if her perfect neighborhood had been worth the cost. Outside, she could hear people talking as they walked past her house, their voices low but clear in the evening air. "Can you believe what she did? They say she might go to prison." Always knew she was crazy about those rules. Margaret turned away from the window, finally beginning to understand that her standing in the community was destroyed, just like the pool she had filled with cement. The Bensenville County Courthouse was unusually crowded on the morning of February 12, 2024. The trial of Margaret Wilkins versus the state had attracted significant attention, not just from locals, but from news outlets across the country. Stories about HOA Karen and her concrete revenge had gone viral online, with millions sharing and commenting on the case. Margaret sat stiffly at the defense table beside her attorney, Richard Hayes. She wore a conservative navy blue suit and had her hair freshly styled, but nothing could hide the stress of the past months. She had lost weight, and deep lines had formed around her mouth and eyes. Across the aisle, District Attorney Sarah Lopez arranged her papers at the prosecution table. Behind her sat Jason and Mei Chen, along with several neighbors from Sycamore Estates who had been called as witnesses. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Peterson," called the bailiff. As the judge entered and the trial began, Margaret kept her eyes forward, avoiding the stares from the packed gallery. "The state calls Mike Ramirez to the stand," Gay Lopez announced after opening statements. Mike, the supervisor from Bensenville Concrete, nervously approached the witness stand. After being sworn in, he described the events of that July day. "She showed me papers with an official HOA stamp," Mike testified. "She said it was an emergency remediation of a safety hazard. She had keys to the property and everything." "And did you believe her?" Lopez asked. "Yes, ma'am. She acted very official, with her clipboard and everything. I've done HOA jobs before, and it seemed normal, except..." "Except what, Mr. Ramirez?" Mike shifted uncomfortably. "Well, a neighbor came by saying we shouldn't be there. That made me nervous, but Ms. Wilkins said he was just a troublemaker who didn't understand HOA rules." Throughout the day, more witnesses took the stand. Tom Johnson described trying to stop the concrete pouring. Barbara Williams testified that no emergency board meeting had ever been called and no authorization given for the destruction. Ms. Wilkins had no authority to take such action, Barbara stated firmly. Even if the pool had violated guidelines, which it didn't, the proper procedure would have been fines followed by a court order, never destruction of property. The most damaging testimony came from a digital forensics expert who had examined Margaret's computer and phone. "We found a folder labeled Chen violation containing dozens of photos of the pool, along with text messages and emails discussing her plans," the expert testified. In one text to her sister dated June 28, Ms. Wilkins wrote, and I quote, "Going to teach this Chen family a lesson they'll never forget. Let's see them ignore me when their precious pool is gone." Murmurs filled the courtroom until Judge Peterson called for order. When it was the defense's turn, Richard Hayes did his best to portray Margaret as a dedicated community servant who had made a serious error in judgment. "Ms. Wilkins has served her community tirelessly for 15 years, Hayes argued. She believed she was acting within her authority to maintain community standards. But the evidence against Margaret was overwhelming. The security camera footage from Jason's house, played in court, clearly showed her directing the entire operation with calm determination. On the third day of trial, Margaret finally took the stand in her own defense. Under Hayes' gentle questioning, she explained her dedication to Sycamore Estates and her belief that the pool violated guidelines. "I may have been overzealous," she admitted, "but I was only trying to protect our community's standards and property values." During cross-examination, D.A. Lopez was relentless. "Ms. Wilkins, did you forge the board approval document you showed to Bensonville Concrete?" Lopez asked directly. Margaret hesitated. "I created a document that reflected what I believed would be the board's decision if there had been time for a meeting." "So that's a yes. You forged an official document." "I was acting in the community's best interest," Margaret insisted, "by destroying an $8,000 pool that belonged to a family with young children. How exactly was that in anyone's best interest?" By the time Margaret stepped down from the witness stand, her face was flushed and her hands were shaking. The case went to the jury the following morning after closing arguments. Few in the courtroom were surprised when the jury returned after just 3 hours of deliberation. On the count of criminal damage to property in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. As the jury foreman read out guilty verdicts for all charges, Margaret's shoulders slumped. That HOA Karen, who had ruled Sycamore Estates with an iron fist for 15 years, was finally facing the consequences of her actions. 1 month after the guilty verdict, Margaret Wilkins returned to the Bensonville County Courthouse for her sentencing hearing. The media presence had grown even larger, with news vans lining the street outside. The case had sparked nationwide debates about HOA powers and homeowner rights. Margaret sat beside her attorney, looking much older than her 58 years. The stress of the trial and public humiliation had taken a visible toll. Her once perfect hair now showed streaks of gray that she had stopped coloring, and her confident posture was replaced by a nervous slouch. Judge Peterson entered the courtroom and addressed Margaret directly before announcing her sentence. "Ms. Wilkins, this court has rarely seen such a clear abuse of perceived authority," he began. "You used your position to carry out a personal vendetta against a family who had done nothing wrong. You destroyed their property, violated their home, and showed no remorse until faced with consequences." Margaret stared at the floor as the judge continued. "However, I'd also consider your lack of prior criminal history and the many letters from community members who spoke of your years of service before this incident." Judge Peterson adjusted his glasses and read from his notes. "For the felony charges of criminal damage to property, breaking and entering, and fraudulent misrepresentation, I hereby sentence you to 5 years in state prison, with all 5 years suspended." A murmur ran through the courtroom. "You will serve 3 years of supervised probation, pay $25,000 in restitution to the Chen family, and complete 500 hours of community service. Additionally, you are permanently barred from serving on any homeowners association board or similar community governance position." As the sentence was read, Jason and Mei Chen nodded in agreement. They had told the prosecutor they didn't want Margaret to go to prison. They just wanted to be made whole and ensure she couldn't do this to anyone else. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around all parties. Margaret hurried to her daughter's waiting car without comment, while Jason stopped briefly to speak. "Today isn't about revenge," he told the cameras. "It's about justice and making sure homeowners know their rights. No HOA should have the power to destroy someone's property, no matter what rules they claim were broken." The case's impact spread far beyond Sycamore Estates. Within weeks, 3 state legislators introduced bills nicknamed the Pool Law, strengthening homeowner protections against HOA overreach. HOAs across the country began reviewing their bylaws and enforcement procedures, fearful of similar incidents. Back in Sycamore Estates, the community was healing. The newly elected HOA board, which included Tom Johnson and Rose Martinez, focused on rebuilding trust with residents. Their first official act was to approve Jason's plans for a new in-ground pool, with unanimous support. By summer, construction crews were digging out the concrete monstrosity that Margaret had created. Using the restitution money and additional damages from the HOA's insurance policy, Jason was able to install a beautiful in-ground pool with a stone patio surround. On Memorial Day weekend, the Chen family hosted a neighborhood pool party. Almost everyone from Sycamore Estates attended, including several board members. "To new beginnings," Jason toasted, raising a glass of lemonade as neighbors gathered around the sparkling blue water. Children splashed happily while adults chatted on the new deck chairs. Margaret, meanwhile, had moved in with her daughter in Arizona. As part of her community service, she worked at a housing rights nonprofit, helping people understand tenant and homeowner protections, an irony not lost on anyone who knew her story. The last anyone in Sycamore Estates heard, she was taking a class on conflict resolution at a community college. As for the concrete that had been removed from Jason's yard, Tom Johnson had suggested they use pieces of it to create stepping stones throughout the community garden, a reminder that even the worst situations could be transformed into something positive. You know what's funny? May said to Jason as they watched their children swim in the new pool. In the end, we got a much nicer pool than we started with. Jason smiled. Sometimes you have to go through the worst to get to the best. And in Sycamore Estates, the legend of the HOA Karen and the concrete pool became a cautionary tale that residents would tell for years to come, a reminder that rules without compassion aren't worth following, and that no position of power, no matter how small, should ever be abused.